Words of Stone by Kevin Henkes. 1. Blaze. Blaze Werle buried Ortman before breakfast. It was the 5th of July, and already the day was white hot. Blaze peeled off his t-shirt and tossed it on the hard ground. He shoveled quickly and furtively, making a small, neat hole the size of a basketball. When the digging was through, Blaze knelt, and using both arms and cupped hands, filled the hole back up, covering Ortman forever. There was something fierce about the manner in which Blaze worked the determined line of his mouth, the tension that rippled across his back. Dirt stuck to Blaze's sweaty body like breadcrumbs, his damp red hair clung to his forehead in ringlets. Blaze slapped the ground flat with the palms of his hands, making a thudding sound and remembering all the other burials, glancing at the nearby stones that marked them. Burials. There had been 4 others before Ortman. Not counting his mother's. The small graves formed a partial ring around the huge black locust tree on the hill near the highway behind Blaze's house. First there had been Benny. Then Ajax. Next Ken. Then Harold. And now Ortman. Blaze wondered what he would do once the circle was complete. Where would he bury then? He was 10 years old. Would he still need to do this when he was 12? 15? He hoped not. He was tired of being afraid. Blaze stood and stamped the dirt over Ortman one last time. He picked up the stone he had chosen earlier that morning and held it for a few seconds, as if it were a large egg containing precious life. He had chosen the stone because of its markings, pale mossy blotches that looked like bullseyes. Blaze set the stone down firmly in place. "Goodbye, Ortman," he whispered. Blaze backed up, scratched the scars on his ankles with either foot, ran his dirty hand through his hair, and stared at the gravesite until the crescent of stones blurred before him, becoming a broken pearl bracelet around the arm of a tree it bound. On the way down the hill toward home, Blaze was already creating someone new in his mind to take Ortman's place. Someone who would be big. Someone who would be tall. Someone who would be fearless. Someone who would be everything Blaze was not. Blaze was slight, with small feet and hands. He thought his fingers resembled birthday candles, especially compared to his father's ample, knuckly ones. At school, Blaze was the shortest student in his class. His identity with many kids from other grades hinged solely upon his size and his red hair. His hair was so distinctive, in fact, that passers-by often turned their heads to take notice. His clear blue eyes had a similar effect on people. Freckles peppered Blaze's cheeks and the bridge of his nose. His eyelashes were full and as transparent as fishing line. And he was fearful. Blaze swatted at the leafy, waist-high weeds that surrounded him and thought, "I am a contradiction. My name is Blaze, and I'm afraid of fire." And fire was only the beginning of a long list of things that made Blaze's head prickle just thinking of them. Fire. Large dogs. Wasps. The dark. And then there were the other things. The more important things. The really frightening ones. Nightmares. The Ferris wheel at the fairgrounds. The 4th of July. Blaze fixed his attention on the drooping slate roof of his house in the near distance. "Come on, Simon," he said over his shoulder into the warm breeze. "Let's go eat." "Morning, Blaze," Nova called pleasantly when she heard the screen door open and gently close. "Morning, Grandma," Blaze said, entering the kitchen. He walked to the sink and began washing his hands methodically with liquid dish soap, making a thick lather that worked its way up his arms. "Ortman's dead," he said matter-of-factly in his head, watching a tiny pinkish-blue bubble rise from his hands. "Now I've got Simon." Blaze didn't believe in imaginary friends the way he truly had when he was younger. He didn't set places for them at the table or make himself as small as possible in bed to leave room for them. He didn't talk to them out loud when anyone might hear. But every July he formed a new one. It was habit as much as anything else. In a way, he compared it to Nova's practice of saying rabbit, rabbit, rabbit for good luck on the first day of each month. It had to be her first words spoken or else it didn't work. Nova was far from superstitious, and yet, if she forgot to say it, she seemed annoyed with herself all morning. Blaze also compared it to the relationship his father had with God. Although he had told Blaze many times that he didn't really know what he believed, Glenn said that he prayed every now and then. He talked to God when no one else was around. Glenn had his version of God. Nova had rabbit, rabbit, rabbit. And Blaze had Simon. "Well, what can I get you for breakfast?" Nova asked mildly. Blaze had been looking out the window toward the hill. He turned and faced his grandmother. "Scrambled eggs, please," he said. And Nova hummed while she made them. At the stove, with her back to Blaze, Nova's wispy moth-colored hair looked just like a dandelion right before you make a wish and blow it. But nothing else about Nova was wispy. She was generous in both size and spirit. Breakfast was Blaze's favorite meal of the day, and the kitchen was his favorite room in the house. Towels, pots, pans, and various other cooking utensils hung on hooks from the walls and ceiling, reminding Blaze of the buy-and-sell shop in town. Four wide windows let in enough sunlight to balance the clutter. In the early morning, the dramatic shadows of the suspended spatulas and ladles spilled down the flowered wallpaper like stalactites. Or were they stalagmites? Blaze could never keep them straight. He had confused them on his final science test of the school year only last month. During the summer, Blaze always ate breakfast with Nova, just the two of them at the thick, round oak table. Nova unerringly sensed Blaze's moods. She knew when he wanted to talk and when quiet seemed to be what was needed. If Nova wasn't asking Blaze questions or maintaining a peaceful, necessary silence, she was humming, as she was now. That meant she was deep in thought. Blaze was certain that Nova's low murmuring that morning was due to the cucumber beetle she had been battling in her squash patch. Books and magazines on organic gardening were stacked on the counter by the sink like dirty dishes. Humming. Then silence. Then only the sound of silverware playing against china. "I don't know how you do it getting up at this hour when you don't have to," Glenn said, suddenly appearing in the kitchen doorway. "Hi, Dad," Blaze said with a start, surprised by Glenn's unusually early jump on the day. His eyes skated up to meet his father's. Ordinarily breakfast was long finished by the time Glenn made it out of bed. "Morning, Glenn. Eggs today?" Nova asked. "Just coffee." He padded barefooted across the cracking linoleum and reached for a mug from the cupboard. Glenn was tall and big-boned. His straight blonde hair fell into his eyes and barely grazed his shoulders, hiding the ringed birthmark on the back of his neck. It was purple and looked like Saturn. When Blaze was mad at his father, he pretended that the birthmark meant that Glenn was really an alien from outer space. "So what's on the agenda for you two today?" Glenn asked, filling his mug. He sat at the table precisely halfway between Blaze and Nova. "Cucumber beetles," Nova said. "I'm going to try to lick them with a mixture of vanilla and water. It's a trick I read about in one of my magazines," she added, working her fingers as if she held a spray bottle. "And you?" Glenn said, looking at Blaze. Blaze shrugged. "Nothing really." Glenn rubbed his steel gray eyes and yawned, his wide unshaven jaw opening and closing like a machine. "Want a ride into town? You could call someone from school." "Nah," Blaze replied, wrinkling his nose and shaking his head. "Tea'll take you to the lake or the park. Anywhere you want to go." "The moon?" Blaze joked. Glenn yawned and chuckled at the same time. "I think I'll just mess around here," Blaze told him. After rubbing his eyes again, Glenn massaged the space between his eyebrows. "Just don't think too much," he said slowly, turning his mug on the table and winking. "It's not good for you." He rose with his coffee and headed toward the back door. He stopped at the sink and leaned against it momentarily. "Oh, by the way," he said. He thrust his hand deep into his pocket and pulled out something small. He flung it gently across the tabletop. It was an old rusty skeleton key. It stopped right beside Blaze's plate, kissing his fork. "I found it yesterday," Glenn said. "For your collection." "Thanks," Blaze answered. He watched Glenn disappear down the hallway, the key floating on the fringe of his vision. His ankles itched. Blaze knew that Glenn wouldn't give him keys if he knew why he saved them. But here was a new one. Right before him. An ancient thing. It might be my best one yet, Blaze thought. The key's sharp metallic scent tickled Blaze's nostrils. He scooped it up and fingered it, and it seemed to burn in his hand. Blaze wondered who it had once belonged to, what lock it would release, whose door it might open. It would be a typical July day. Glenn would spend it in the sagging garage that he had converted into a studio, emerging at dinner time flecked with paint of all colors. Then he'd return and work again until very late, maybe until dawn. Unlike most fathers, Glenn was home all day in the summer. He was a high school art teacher who devoted his entire vacation to painting large canvases that Blaze liked, but didn't quite understand. Nova would bustle about the kitchen and her garden concocting, canning, weeding, pruning, and trying to exterminate cucumber beetles for all time. And Blaze would wander throughout the house and around the hill, occasionally talking to someone that no one else could see. And it would be a typical July night for Blaze. In bed, he would will himself not to dream. Or, at least, not to remember his dreams when he awoke. He would take the library book from his nightstand, open it halfway, and place it beside him to look as if he had been reading. His mason jar filled with his lost key collection would be on the floor within reach. Then, his lamp still on, Blaze would settle in among his nest of 4 pillows, wishing and waiting for morning light. 2. Blaze. When Blaze woke up the next morning, his chest ached with strangeness. He had been dreaming. It was a dream he had had before. In it, a maze of black snakes burst into flames at his feet while he struggled to open a door. The door was held tightly closed by a series of locks. His mother's voice came from behind the door. Sometimes in the dream he would have a key. But even when he did, it would never work. "Don't think about it," Blaze told himself. His dreams were always so vivid during the summer. He might not remember having a dream for months, but come July they would return. It was peculiar the way that worked. Blaze blinked and looked around. His room focused about him, becoming familiar and touchable. The library book from the night before was now closed and neatly placed on his nightstand, his bedside lamp turned off. Although he had never actually seen Nova or Glenn do these things, he had often sensed a presence passing as a shadow, removing the book, turning off the light, tugging the bedclothes up under his chin, touching his forehead, pulling the door closed. Blaze sat up and swung his legs out from under the sheet. It was dawn. A gust of wind caused the loose window screen to flutter and the faded plaid curtains to balloon and collapse. The curtains had worn thin in many places and were at least as old as Blaze. So was the large, multicolored oval rug that covered most of the floor. But nearly everything else was relatively new in comparison. The bookshelf, the bed, the nightstand, the dresser. Blaze could still remember the old blue-striped wallpaper, but now the walls were white. He had picked the paint himself. Snowflake, it was called on the paint chart. It was several summers earlier that Glenn had urged Blaze to redecorate his room. "I could paint the solar system on your ceiling," Glenn had suggested. And we could buy some of those neat glow-in-the-dark stars to stick on. Glenn paused, tapping his fingers on his chin. We could redo the walls, too. This wallpaper's not the greatest. We'd have to clean this place out first, though. Get rid of some of this old baby stuff. As he spoke, Glenn gestured vaguely toward the toys, knickknacks, and books that crowded Blaze's shelves, drawers, closet, and the dusty space under his bed. Things he had long outgrown. What do you think? Blaze was looking at his prized possession, a plastic Noah's Ark replica perched atop the low overstuffed bookcase. Okay, he answered reluctantly, not wanting to disappoint Glenn. Great! But can I keep my Ark? Blaze's voice was urgent. Glenn hugged him. Of course, he said into his son's red hair. Blaze picked the Ark off the shelf and clutched it tightly. And can we just paint the walls and ceiling white? No solar system? You bet, said Glenn. Blaze figured that the lighter the walls and ceiling were, the lighter his room would be at night. Blaze still had the Ark. He kept it tucked safely under his bed. Out of sight if a friend from school came over. Now he pulled it out and brought it to the window. Resting one end of it on the sill, he held it in place with his stomach and drew open the curtains to glance at the hill. He did this every morning. But that morning there was something different. Something very strange. Something so strange that Blaze stepped back from the window in surprise, causing his Ark to fall. It cracked in half at his feet, little animals scattering across the floor like the pieces of a shattered glass. A chill hit Blaze in the small of his back and spread to his neck. Written with stones on the broad, mowed stretch of the hillside was the word Rena. Blaze felt hazy and anxious. His heart rattled. He closed his eyes and counted to 10 before opening them again. Nothing had changed. Squinting, Blaze leaned on the windowsill, his nose pressed to the screen, then pulled back. The word was still there. It seemed to fill the window. The window seemed to fill the room. Blaze was smaller than ever. Rena. Who did this, Simon? Blaze whispered. His first thought was to wake Glenn, but something deep and instinctive led him in another direction. Temporarily forgetting about his Ark, Blaze slipped into some shorts, a t-shirt, and shoes. His hands shook, fumbling with his laces and getting tangled in the folds of his shirt. But, once dressed, he managed to move quickly and quietly so as not to wake anyone melting down the stairs, tiptoeing throughout the house, and then pushing up the hill with all his might. When Blaze stopped, he was gasping for air. He doubled over, hands on knees, and tried to breathe evenly. His breath felt warm on his skin. He lifted his head. The letters were enormous up so close. Impulsively, Blaze shoved stone after stone aside with his feet, scrambling them so no one else could read the word. A few he heaved with his hands, they tumbled down the slope. A round and smooth stone with green rings on it caught his attention. It looked exactly like the stone he had chosen to mark Ortman's grave. He examined it closely. Recognized it. Oh, no, Blaze said, stunned all over again. The sky and the grass changed places in his vision as he raced for the black locust tree. After stumbling twice, he used his hands in an animal-like fashion to help him move without falling. He wanted to cry. His stones were missing. All 5 of them. Whoever had written Rena had used them to help construct the letters. Blaze circled the tree a number of times, raising a cloud of dust. Then he sat resting against it, thinking. Waiting. Without the slightest idea of what to do next. A group of crows swooped down nearby. They strutted in a chaotic formation, their calls long and raucous. In a sudden beating of glossy black wings, they took off again. Up, up, up they flew, and Blaze watched, feeling as if he were sinking. 3. Blaze. Blaze spent the morning in his bedroom, feeling unconnected. He was fixing his arc with Elmer's glue. While he waited for the glue to dry, he gathered the small animals he had dropped earlier and played with them, first grouping them by color, then lining them up in a row. He held a memory of doing this with his mother, Rena. He remembered placing the pairs of animals, elephants, giraffes, bears, sheep, on one of the inner braided coils of the rug in his room, following the rug's contour, curving the line of the procession until it formed an oval. Rena and Blaze in the middle. Now there was only one of each plastic animal. When Blaze was 5 and Rena died, he took one animal from each pair and smashed them with a brick behind the house. Because the ark was his favorite toy and he wanted to punish himself somehow. Because a pair of anything didn't seem right. Periodically, Blaze peered out the window, turning his gaze from left to right, checking for another message in stone. He was continually relieved when he found only the remains of the first, still strewn haphazardly across the hill like popcorn on a theater floor. Who did it? He kept asking himself that question. And he kept coming up with no answer. Although Blaze knew in his heart that neither Nova nor Glenn had done it, he toyed with the possibility. Nova. She rarely left the house or garden, except to go grocery shopping. It was unusual for her to complain, but Blaze knew that by the end of the day her thick legs were puffy and sore. She often had to elevate them with pillows. Once, she said she had the legs of a 90-year-old woman, even though she was only 60. Her legs reminded Blaze of Map's bumpy blue veins connecting feet to knees like crooked highways. When he was younger, Blaze had found comfort in running his fingers over the bulging veins. Compared to them, the scars on his ankles seemed insignificant. The pinkish skin on his ankles was rippled, as if tiny worms were trapped underneath. It was as if twisting snakes were trapped under Nova's skin. Her legs didn't stop her from cooking and gardening with a passion, but trudging up the hill and rolling stones around to spell the name of her dead daughter was surely the last thing she would do. And Glenn? It wasn't his style. Glenn was a private person. And anyway, it was hard enough to coax him from his studio for dinner or a telephone call on a summer day. Blaze knew he wouldn't take time away from his painting to do something like this. Who then? Not his classmates. None of them lived this far out in the country. Blaze was the first one picked up and the last one dropped off by the bus each school day. And although Blaze didn't have a best friend, he was treated with genuine fondness by students and teachers alike. He was smart, but not the smartest. Shy, but not the most shy. He was 9th fastest in his class. And he was considered by some to be the best artist in the entire school. He could draw nearly any popular cartoon character upon request. There were only 2 fellow classmates that Blaze didn't like, Teddy Berman and Chelsea Kurz, but they both liked him, so they were out of the question. Teddy was a tiresome braggart and Chelsea was a tireless brown-noser. At Allenby Shepherd Elementary, Blaze was often called Big Red, a nickname that didn't bother him at all, even by Mr. Weeb, the principal, who'd always try to ruffle Blaze's hair if he spotted him among the noisy throng that paraded past his office on the way to and from recess. Floy Stark was a possibility, but a vague one. She lived alone on the other side of the hill in a tidy, box-like house the color of celery. She was about Nova's age, maybe younger. Sometimes Blaze lay on the hill and watched the Stark house. Nothing interesting ever happened. Floy did ordinary things like hang laundry on the clothesline, wash windows, cut the grass, and play fetch with a terrifying German shepherd she called Gary, who was, thank goodness, usually chained safely to the garage. That was about it. Blaze couldn't think of anyone else. Help me, Simon, Blaze said, flopping onto his bed like a fish. Pressed into his hand was a tiny plastic bird, wings outstretched, anticipating flight. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, trying to weave a plan. And remembering. Soon after Rena died, Blaze, Nova, and Glenn went to a therapist together. Blaze couldn't remember how many sessions they had gone to, but he would never forget how uncomfortable he felt at them. "She looks at me like I'm an ant on a stick," Blaze told Glenn and Nova meekly, after what turned out to be their last session. They were walking across the parking lot toward their car. Blaze inhaled deeply, so happy to be out of Dr. Zondag's office. He sniffed his sleeve, the lemony smell of the office still lingered, and he waved his shirt tail in the air. Glenn and Nova shared a long glance. "It's really important to talk about things, you know," Glenn said cautiously, leaning against the car, jingling his keys. Blaze nodded. He waited for Glenn to unlock the door, then crawled into the back seat. The late afternoon sun spilled into the car, creating sharp-edged shadows. Blaze moved his hand in and out of the warm light. They stopped at a drive-in restaurant on the way home. Before they ordered, Glenn turned in his seat and leaned over toward Blaze. His head was touching the roof of the car, pulling his hair to one side as if he had slept on it funny. "We don't have to go back," Glenn said slowly. "But you have to promise that you'll always ask me anything you want to. Even if you think it's silly or stupid. I want you to always be able to talk to me." Glenn ran his hand along the back of Blaze's neck and rested it on his shoulder. "Mom would want it that way." Semis and cars rolled by on the highway while they had dinner. Blaze ate nearly half of his hamburger and he almost finished his junior chocolate shake, something he had never done before. He slurped his shake so quickly he got a headache. The pain thrilled him and he tried it again, egged on by his sense of relief. As they pulled out of the driveway and threaded into the stream of traffic to go home, Glenn said, "Nothing's too big or too small to tell me or ask me. You know that." Blaze did know that. And yet he couldn't bring himself to tell Glenn about what he had seen on the hill that morning. For several reasons. First, he was beginning to wonder if he had only imagined it or dreamed it. That's what he wanted to think. Second, if it hadn't been a dream, would Glenn believe him anyway? Considering that Blaze had already jumbled the stones so that the hill looked as it always did? Third, he was still shy when it came to talking about Rena with Glenn sometimes, even though he knew that he shouldn't be. Sometimes his unspoken words were almost tangible, he was so close to talking. Sometimes he stopped himself because he didn't want to take a chance on making Glenn sad. Blaze had seen Glenn cry once when Rena was ill. It had made Blaze feel as small as a dot and completely afraid. Now and then Blaze heard Glenn and Nova talk about Rena in what Blaze thought were sad, hushed voices. Of course, Glenn said things about Rena to Blaze, remembered things with him, but Glenn always initiated the conversations. That was the difference. Blaze didn't want to ask or say something about Rena if he couldn't be absolutely certain that the time was perfect and that Glenn would want to talk about her. Even at school, if Blaze didn't understand something, he'd often try to figure it out by himself rather than raise his hand and ask a question. And then there was the other reason. The eerie thought he was trying to suppress. The thought that his mother was somehow responsible for writing her name on the hill outside his bedroom window. It was then that Blaze decided to handle this thing on his own. With Simon, of course. Maybe he hadn't been able to ride the Ferris wheel on the 4th of July. Again. But this was surely a way to prove his bravery. He would get to the bottom of this. Blaze didn't want to be afraid anymore. 4. Joselle. Joselle Stark dried her eyes with the back of her hand. "No, I'm not crying," she called fiercely. She was crouched on the ivory wicker clothes hamper in her grandmother's narrow bathroom. She wound her arms tightly around her knees and rocked back and forth. The hamper creaked and sagged in rhythm. "Joselle? What are you doing in there?" "I'm coming, Grammy." Joselle scooted down and looked at herself in the mirror on the back of the door. I'm a mess, she thought, sniffling. Her dark brown hair hung in tangled strands around her face, one untamed clump falling over her right eye. I wish my hair would cover my mouth, she muttered, flipping her hair back. Jocelle's teeth were perfectly shaped, but they were sizes too big for her mouth. In fact, her teeth were so big, it took a conscious effort on Jocelle's part to keep her mouth closed. Piano keys, she called them. And she had the nervous habit of bringing her hand up to her mouth, pretending to play a tune on her teeth, humming as she did. Jocelle wasn't fat, but her knees and elbows were dimpled like a baby's, and her arms and legs looked meaty. She was wearing an extra-large raspberry sweatshirt with the sleeves cut off, it hung to her thighs. The circles under her eyes matched her clothing in color. Jocelle knew that her grandmother's eyesight wasn't terrific, but she knew that her grandmother wasn't blind either. She hoped her grandmother wouldn't be able to tell that her eyes were bloodshot. Jocelle stuck her tongue out at herself in the mirror. She flushed the toilet for effect, unlocked the door, and marched into the hallway, her red rubber thongs slapping crisply against her feet. "What were you doing in there, sweetie?" Floy asked. "Grammy, you're old enough to know what goes on in a bathroom," Jocelle replied, walking away, an agonized look on her face. "I'm also old enough to know when someone's been crying." Floy grabbed Jocelle by the shoulders and spun her around. Floy was strong, despite her petite size, her grip unflinching. "You were crying." She drew Jocelle against her chest. They were so close, Jocelle could feel 2 heartbeats. Jocelle started to cry again. "I hate and despise my mother," she sobbed into her grandmother's sleeveless lavender shift. I know, Floy soothed. "Come to the sofa. Let me do your eyelids." Floy settled into the low end of the worn velour sofa and Jocelle lay down, her head on her grandmother's lap, her eyes closed firmly. Although their visits were seldom and sporadic, the instant Floy touched Jocelle's eyelids it was as if they had never been apart. "I've done this for you since you were a baby," Floy said. "Since forever," Jocelle whispered. "Relax," Floy said, as she gently stroked Jocelle's eyelids over and over. "Your eyelids are the color of my needlepoint lilacs." Jocelle couldn't have cared less about lilacs. Or nady point. Her mother had abandoned her. The beautiful Vicky had taken off with her boyfriend Rick to get away to try to be happy for a while without any interruptions. The more Jocelle thought about it, the more upset she became. Her body shook, tears slid down her cheeks. Her mother had done stupid, impulsive things before, but this was by far the worst. And the stupid, impulsive things usually had to do with men. Life would be going along just fine until the beautiful Vicky became interested in someone new. As her interest escalated, so would her time away from Jocelle and so would her rash behavior. Before Rick, Vicky had been involved with a man named Bert. This was late last summer. Bert had come into the restaurant where Vicky worked and charmed her completely. Bert was all she could talk about. It wasn't long before he moved in. Before Bert, Vicky and Jocelle had watched the Mary Tyler Moore Show in reruns every weekday night after the 10 o'clock news. Since it was summer, Vicky didn't mind if Jocelle stayed up so late. It became ritual. Every night Mary Tyler Moore. Every night cream soda. Every night microwave popcorn sprinkled with Parmesan cheese. Every night Vicky and Jocelle sprawled on the futon, the little electric fan turning side to side, cooling them off as they licked their cheesy fingers clean and laughed at Mary Richards and Rhoda Morgenstern. Every night the hypnotic light of the television flashing across the walls of the dark room like a fire in a cave. "This is my all-time favorite show," Vicky would say. "We could watch it all night," Jocelle would add, scooching closer to her mother. "If it was on all night." But as soon as Bert came, everything changed. No more Mary Tyler Moore, he preferred M*A*S*S*H and Vicky let him watch it. No more microwave popcorn with Parmesan cheese and cream soda alone with Vicky. No more comfortable routine. He helps pay for the groceries and the electric bills, Vicky would tell Joselle. And besides, he makes me happy. He doesn't make me happy, Joselle would counter. And you hardly spend any time with me anymore. I've spent more time with you than with anyone nearly my whole life. What about Mary Tyler Moore? You even said it was your favorite show. So I changed my mind. Vicky sighed, exhaling frustration, losing patience quickly. *M***S**H is real. Watch it, you might learn something. Joselle was ecstatic when Bert finally moved out about 4 months later. In a matter of weeks, things settled back to the way they had been, and Joselle and Vicky's spats were few and far between. But then Rick entered their lives, and the cycle began repeating itself. A small part of Joselle seemed to understand what made Vicky change from being the mother she loved to being the mother she didn't. But she was always unprepared when it happened. Joselle brought her hand up to her mouth and began playing Strangers in the Night on her teeth. Listen, it won't be so bad, Foy said, competing with the melody. I'm sure your mother will be back soon. You'll like it here. And anyway, it could be worse. That little Werla boy from around the hill doesn't even have a mother. Suddenly Joselle stopped humming and crying and trembling. She sat up and stared at Foy with great astonished eyes. You mean that skinny redhead I saw sitting on the hill this morning doesn't have a mother? Foy nodded. Tell me, Joselle demanded, snatching her grandmother's hands and squeezing them like sponges. She hoped that the skinny redhead's life story would be worse than hers. She hoped that it would be absolutely dreadful. Joselle listened hungrily. She hung on Foy's every word until even the smallest incident blossomed into full tragedy in her mind. And there was tragedy enough, with or without the aid of Joselle's imagination. The boy's name was Blaise Werla. And his mother had died when he was just 5 years old. Of cancer. Her name was Rena, Foy said, doing Joselle's eyelids again. She was so young. Rena. Joselle liked the sound of the name. She thought it was kind of exotic and sexy. She repeated it softly, drawing out the long E sound like a bird call. Rena. She died in the middle of the summer, Foy continued, when it was hot and muggy. She had long, thick red hair, and I remember thinking how sad it was when she lost it. Lost her hair? Joselle said, her eyes widening. From the treatment. Chemotherapy, it's called, Foy explained. It made her hair fall out. She wore pretty scarves then. Bright ones. The last time I saw her, she was resting on a lawn chair in their yard wearing a chartreuse scarf that was knotted at the top of her head. Joselle imagined the scene. The exotic and sexy Rena was so thin you could practically see every bone in her body. Blaise, her tiny son, was weeping hysterically, picking clumps of her hair off the ground and stuffing them into his pockets. The confused husband, who Joselle knew nothing about, was hiding behind a nearby bush staring into space like a lawn ornament. Foy sighed deeply, regaining Joselle's attention. Go on, Grammy, Joselle ordered. Oh, sweetie, let's talk about something else. Let's talk about something happy. If we did that, I wouldn't have anything to say. Oh, Joselle. At least tell me more about the boy, Joselle said in her best supplicating voice. Well, Foy said, shrugging, he's quiet and small and he's about your age. He looks a lot like his mother to me. I remember about a year after Rena died, there was an accident at the fairgrounds. A fire. He burned his legs on the 4th of July and spent the rest of that summer wrapped in bandages up to his waist. Poor little thing. Of course, he's fine now. I don't really know him, but I see him alone up on the hill a lot. From my window. He must like it up there. So you see, Floy added, you're not the only one with a complicated life. What's that mean? Complicated? Oh, I don't know. Confusing, I guess. Mixed up. Floy took her glasses off and cleaned them in her dress. But enough of him. Let's talk about you. No way, Giselle replied quickly, getting up and clapping her hands. She was thinking about the word complicated. Well, then, why don't we unpack your bags and get your things organized? Floy suggested cheerfully. I'm just so glad you're here with me. Giselle wanted more details. What about the funeral? What about the father? Did he remarry? What did Blaze's legs look like when they were burned? What did they smell like? What did they look like now? But she figured that she'd work them out of Floy eventually. And the things that Floy wouldn't reveal or had forgotten or didn't know, Giselle would simply have to make up. And they would be the most awful things of all. 5. Giselle paced about Floy's small house, surveying every corner like a cat. Since she was going to be staying here for a while, she needed to reacquaint herself with the way things looked, smelled, and felt. Giselle moved from room to room, shoving chairs and floor lamps an inch or two in random directions, leaving her mark. She rearranged Floy's Hummel figurines, turning some so that the backs of the children's heads with their odd peaks of hair faced outward. Just be careful with those, Floy warned, hovering over Giselle's shoulder, referring to the Hummels. They're worth money. Giselle discovered Floy's nail polish, and they took turns painting each other's fingernails and toenails. Giselle was intrigued by the names of the colors, Rambling Rose, Cherub Frost, Iceberry. She wanted each nail to be a different color, but Floy didn't have that many bottles and some were empty. You look racy, Grammy, Giselle said, having a giggle fit. When their hands and feet had dried, Floy made popcorn and Giselle strummed the kernels with a needle and thread, making necklaces. The necklaces reminded Giselle of Hawaiian leis, and the popcorn reminded her of her mother. Giselle laced the garlands around her neck and did a rhythmic hula dance for Floy. Floy found it humorous until Giselle carried the joke to extremes, bumping her rear end into the furniture as part of her dance. Giselle gyrated until she became dizzy, falling into an end table. One of Floy's Hummels, a round-faced girl gazing dreamily at a book, wobbled and nearly fell. That's enough, Floy scolded. And those popcorn necklaces are making grease stains on your shirt. Giselle blushed with shame. Leave me alone, she snapped, her eyes pinpoints of anger. She tramped to the front window and rolled herself into the drape. She stared blankly out the window, twizzling a strand of her hair. After dinner, at the window again, Giselle noticed movement on the hill. It was the red-haired boy. Blaze Werla. Giselle watched him intensely until the window turned blue with the onset of night. Later, on the sofa that was her bed now, Giselle regretted the meanness that she had shown Floy. At that moment she loved Floy more than anyone. I'm sorry, Grammy, she whispered into the lonely night. The only one who heard her was Gary, Floy's German shepherd. He trotted over to Giselle from the kitchen, his tail wagging like a wind-up toy. He rested his head on her pillow, and she kissed him between the eyes. After a reciprocal lick, Gary folded himself up into a knobby sack on the floor beside her. Gary's hairy body and pointy ears made Giselle think of her mother's boyfriend Rick. She wondered where the two of them were. How far they had driven. How long it would take before they wrote or called. It had only been a few days since the beautiful Vicky had informed Giselle that she needed a vacation. And Giselle would never forget that fateful day. Giselle had taken a felt-tip marking pen and drawn black stripes along the edges of her teeth to make them look even more like a real piano keyboard. "Look, Vicky," she had said to her mother excitedly. "You know, the black keys." Joselle pointed to her mouth and opened wide to reveal her handiwork. "God, Joselle," Vicky had replied, throwing down her magazine in exasperation and grabbing Joselle's wrist. "It's things like this that make me." Joselle could fill in the blank many ways. "Crazy, want to send you away forever, regret being a mother." Vicky pulled Joselle into the bathroom and brushed her teeth for her until her gums bled. "It's not a permanent marker," Joselle tried to explain. But all Vicky kept saying was, "I could scream. I could just scream." It was then that Vicky announced that she and Rick were going to take a trip. By themselves. Joselle stayed in the bathroom, alone, crying, rocking on the toilet. There was greenish-gray spittle all over the mirror and on the sink. Joselle knew she would always hate that color. Minty greenish-gray. It wasn't easy getting comfortable on Floyd's old sofa with so much to consider. Joselle played her tongue against her teeth and gums and tried to focus on something stupid and safe. The sofa. Joselle imagined that it had been handsome when it was new, red and firm and plush. Now the dye had faded to a dirty wine color. It was soft, but lumpy. And the patchy raised pattern that was supposed to be roses reminded Joselle of bald mutant camels that were more hump than anything else. But soon the pattern resembled the fabric of one of Vicky's skirts. And then it resembled the upholstery in Rick's car. It took a while, but Joselle finally nestled deep into the cushions, wrapped in a thin blue blanket, tight as a parcel. "Tomorrow I will show Grammy how much I love her," Joselle thought. "And I will complicate the life of Blaise Werle." 6. Joselle. "Thank you, Joselle," Floyd said, smiling. "That was a wonderful breakfast. Where did you learn to cook so well?" "Omelets are easy," Joselle said triumphantly, as she wiped the table with a dishcloth. "And I cook a lot at home. If I didn't, I'd starve to death." Floyd leaned back in her chair, saying nothing, the veins in her neck pulsing. The conversation seemed to have ended. Floyd looked older to Joselle that morning, and her face and neck had a bluish cast to them as though her skin had turned translucent and light were shining through. Floyd had always been thin, but the older Joselle became, the thinner Floyd appeared to be. Almost breakable, like blown glass. "It's true," Joselle said finally. "I would starve. Especially since Rick and the beautiful Vicky took a class at the community college on developing your ESP potential. They lounge around on the futon for hours, which is hardly unusual, and they go into trances to explore other countries. The trances really freak me out. I used to sit and watch them, wondering if they'd be home in time to fix me dinner. Now I just fix it myself. I've gotten good at it." Joselle was playing with crumbs in her hand, and only then did she notice that her hands were still dirty from her secret pre-breakfast task. Little crescent moons of dirt shone through the places on Joselle's fingernails where her nail polish had chipped away. "Well, you can cook for me anytime," Floyd said, working at a spot on the tabletop with her thumb. "I know the beautiful Vicky's your daughter," Joselle said, glancing at Floyd nervously. "And she said, then hesitated a moment, deciding to change the direction in which her comment was headed. "And I was just wondering what I could make you for lunch." "We've got all morning to decide," Floyd said. She rose from the table and re-knotted the ties of her bathrobe. "Just tell me one thing, why do you call her the beautiful Vicky?" "Because that's her name. And she is." Floyd turned around to face the sink, and her entire body began to move as if small waves rippled under her robe. Joselle was certain that Floyd was crying, and her heart dropped as she pulled Floyd toward her. But as their eyes met, Joselle's heart became weightless. Floyd had been holding back laughter. "The beautiful Vicky that takes the cake," Floyd managed to say between shrieks. "Well, I always thought she should be a beautician." Lord knows she spends enough money on cosmetics. Floy poked Joselle with her elbow and howled. They pressed together in hysterics. While Floy went off to shower and dress, Joselle stayed in the kitchen. She opened the silverware drawer and pulled out every teaspoon and tablespoon. She looked at her face in each one. On the back of the spoons, her face was thin and long and right side up. On the other side, her face was wide and upside down. She moved the spoons at varying distances, distorting her face. She was amazed that each time it worked the same upside down on the inside, right side up on the outside. Vicky had shown her this trick years ago, and Joselle still tested it wherever she went. Joselle licked a spoon. My mother is smart, she thought. They had been eating ice cream at the kitchen table right before bed the night that Vicky had presented Joselle with this minor marvel. It's magic, Joselle had said. Try another spoon, Vicky suggested. Joselle tried every spoon in the house, wide-eyed and mystified. Does it only work with chocolate ice cream? Joselle asked. Vicky opened the refrigerator. Let's see, she said, laughing. They tried jam, cold leftover tomato soup, and maple syrup. They tried milk and orange juice, spooning them out of bowls. They tried peanut butter straight from the jar and sugar right out of the sugar bowl. Every spoon is magic, Joselle told Vicky, her voice cracking with excitement. No matter what you're eating with it. Every spoon in the world. They did the dishes together that night, the radio BrimQ. They played with the suds and serenaded one another using the spoons as pretend microphones. It was after midnight when Vicky finally kissed Joselle goodnight and tucked her in. I love being a single girl with you, Vicky whispered. Me, too, said Joselle. She had closed her eyes, lulled by Vicky's voice. She was asleep in minutes. Joselle put the last spoon in its proper place and closed Floy's kitchen drawer. She wondered how her mother could be so perfect sometimes, and other times be as far from perfect as possible. Joselle was pleased. She had accomplished everything she had set out to do for the entire day, and it wasn't even 9 a.m. Not only had she shown Floy how much she loved her by making her breakfast, Joselle had also made Floy laugh harder than she had ever seen anyone laugh. But more importantly, Joselle had done something daring and original. Something that she thought could shake up someone's life. She wasn't exactly sure why she had done it, except she sensed that if she could make someone else more confused than she was, the weight of her own emotions might be lifted. It was worth a try. Misery loves company, Vicky often said. The idea had begun during the night as a tiny seed that kept growing inside her until she was consumed by it, and there was absolutely no way to fight it. It was amazing how everything had come together so easily. Floy had said that he spent a lot of time on the hill. She knew his mother was dead. And she remembered that there were rocks and stones on the hill. In the weak light before breakfast, Joselle had done something that she hoped would complicate the life of Blaise Werle. She knew that if the situation were reversed, it would surely complicate hers. Joselle giggled with delight. She played the themes from The Brady Bunch and The Mary Tyler Moore Show on her teeth. She was in the bathroom with the door locked, sitting on the clothes hamper. When she had finished her tunes, Joselle began decorating her thighs with ballpoint pen tattoos. At first she was going to put them on her arm, but she didn't want anyone to see them. So she settled on her thighs so far up that they would only be visible if she were naked. And no one ever got a glimpse of her. In that condition. Rena was the first tattoo she gave herself. She was using her 4-color pen and chose blue ink, pressing so hard that it hurt. Beneath it, she drew a rose in red ink and a leaf and thorns in green. It looked professional. She admired it. Rena. This was the second time she had written the word Rena that morning. She wanted to write something else with stones on the hillside in a day or